Most people in the stock market are trying to find the next big stock that is going to make them huge returns and make them rich. So what if I told you I just found the next Amazon? And the name of this company is Mercado Libre. And this company is basically the same thing as Amazon, but they are located in Latin America and they dominate this space, where they provide a marketplace for buying and selling items very similar to Amazon, but they are in the entire Latin America. While e-commerce is their main business, they also offer fintech services. But how does Mercado Libre stock compare to Amazon stock? And as we can see, over the past 10 years, Mercado Libre has actually been outperforming Amazon stock by almost doubling the performance of Amazon, with Mercado Libre up almost 1700%, while Amazon's up only 920%. While both performances are really good, Mercado Libre has been outperforming Amazon. In year to date, Mercado Libre is up about 47%, while Amazon's basically flat on from the year to date. So with this being said, I'm going to be using my 7-step stock analysis, where I use my 7 key metrics that I believe are the most important to look at the financial health of Mercado Libre. And at the end of this video, I'm going to be doing the most important thing, where I'm going to be using my intrinsic value calculator that I created to determine the price I'd be willing to pay for Mercado Libre stock. The first metric that I'm going to be looking at for Mercado Libre is the trailing PE ratio, and I want this to be greater than 0, which shows us that they are profitable. And as we can see here, they have a trailing PE ratio of 61.85. So this does show that they are profitable. However, it does look like they are a bit overvalued. Since the PE ratio is the price of the stock divided by the earnings per share, this shows us how much you are paying for $1 of earnings. So with Mercado Libre, you're going to be paying almost $62 for $1 of earnings per share today. So with this being said, if we compare this to the total stock market, it does look overvalued, with the stock market averaging about 20 to 25 PE ratio. And then if we take a look at the forward PE ratio, which we want less than 30, showing that in the future, analysts expect them to trade at a decent valuation. And unlike the trailing PE ratio, the forward PE ratio used the analyst expectations for their earnings per share in the next year. So this shows us the future valuation of Mercado Libre. And right now we have a forward PE ratio at 48.54. So it does show us that Mercado Libre is trading at a pretty rich valuation. However, it will make sense when we look at the growth rate of Mercado Libre. Taking a look at the revenue growth rate, we want this to be growing at a greater than 5% rate. And as we can see here, they are growing insanely fast and at a very consistent rate. They started off in 2010 only making $200 million. And as of 2025, they're actually generating $22 billion in revenue. And they're growing at about a 30% rate over the past 5 years. So this is just insane growth from Mercado Libre. So this looks pretty good. Now taking a look at the net income of Mercado Libre, we also want this to be growing at a greater than 5% rate, because this is the profit that Mercado Libre is going to be making. And as investors, we get a portion of the profits of the company. So we want this to be growing over time. And as we can see here, it was kind of stagnant for the past 10 to 15 years in the 2010s. However, since 2021, we've seen a huge increase in net income, and they're making about $2 billion this year. So they have been increasing their net income at a very fast rate in almost the triple digits. So this looks very good for Mercado Libre, especially if they can keep up this earnings growth rate. Next, I'm going to be taking a look at the shares outstanding of Mercado Libre, and I want them to be decreasing their shares outstanding or buying back shares. And the reason I want them to be buying back shares is because if a company buys back shares, that means there's going to be less shares outstanding for other people to buy. So if you own 10 shares outstanding and they bought back shares over time, those 10 shares outstanding are going to be more valuable and you will own a greater percentage of the company. However, if we take a look at Mercado Libre, they've actually increased their shares over time, but it looks like they're starting to be a bit stagnant on that shares outstanding over the past 2 to 3 years. So hopefully they can stay at this shares outstanding or potentially be buying back shares in the future. But as of right now, they have increased their shares over time. So this does not look good for Mercado Libre because they are diluting us shareholders. Now I'm going to take a look at the balance sheet of Mercado Libre, and I'm going to look at the total debt to equity ratio. I want this to be less than 50%, because if it's less than 50%, that means that they have more than double the amount of equity when compared to their debt. However, if we take a look at the total debt to equity ratio, we can see that they have 155% total debt to equity ratio. This means that they have about 1.5 times more debt than their equity. So they have a lot more debt than equity, and that is a bit of a concern. However, if we take a look at the cash compared to their debt, they have slightly more cash than their debt. So they could honestly pay off their debt right now if they really wanted to. So although the total debt to equity ratio looks pretty bad, the total cash compared to their total debt actually looks good because they actually have negative net debt, which means that they have a surplus of cash compared to their debt. So this looks good for Mercado Libre, even though that is an X on the total debt to equity ratio. And the final metric that I'm going to be looking at for Mercado Libre is the analyst expectations for the next 5 years. And I want to see them expecting a growth rate of greater than 5%. And as we can see here, they're expecting a super fast growth rate out of Mercado Libre at about 35%. So this looks very good for the future for Mercado Libre. Although this isn't guaranteed, obviously, because it's expectations, it's still a very good sign that they're expected to grow at a good rate. So we want them to be growing at a good rate in the future because the stock price normally follows the EPS growth rate. Now I'm going to be using my intrinsic value calculator to determine the price I'd be willing to pay for Mercado Libre stock. And the first thing I have to do is use assumptions for the future on the revenue growth rate. And over the past 5 years, they've been growing at about a 55% rate, which is insanely fast. However, it has been slowing down to about 25% over the past year. So I think actually a reasonable growth rate, because I do think that they can continue to expand in Latin America and potentially go into other countries. While I do think that could be a stretch, but I do think that they can take over Latin America and continue to expand across Latin America. So I think a reasonable growth rate for Mercado Libre is 20%. So I'm going to put 1.2. So with this being said, I think in 10 years they could have about $138 billion in revenue. And right now, Amazon's at about $700 to $800 billion in revenue. So I think this actually looks pretty fair because I also think Latin America could become more developed in 10 years. So I think this looks pretty fair for Mercado Libre. Now for the net profit margin. I think a fair net profit margin for Mercado Libre is about 12.5%. Since they've been anywhere from 5 to 10% over the past few years, I think that they can continue to grow this net profit margin over the next 10 years as they become more mature company. And also since Amazon is starting to get around 10 to 15%, I think that they could achieve about 12.5%. So I'm going to put 0.125, which is 12.5%. And this gives a net income in the future in 10 years at about $17 billion. Where they're at about $2 to $3 billion this year, I think this could be reasonable. Now for the future PE ratio. Since that they're trading at about a 40 to 50 P ratio, I do think that's way too overvalued for this company. But I do think that they deserve a premium compared to the stock market. Since the stock market trades anywhere from 20 to 25 PE ratio, I think this company is growing at a much faster rate compared to the stock market. So I'm actually going to put a P ratio of 28. I think that this is pretty fair since they're a fast growing company and they're in a pretty good market where they can continue to grow at a faster rate. Now for the shares outstanding. Since they're at about 51 million shares outstanding and they've actually stayed at about that for the past 3 years, I'm just going to put that they're going to remain at 51 million. They could be buying back more shares or not, I don't know, but I think that this could be a fair area for Mercado Libre. And now if we take a look at the future share price, I have a future share price of $9,500. And right now they're trading at about $2,500. And with these assumptions, I get an annualized return of 27.83%. So if you believe my assumptions right here, you can make a huge return on Mercado Libre. However, if we go back and start to use more conservative numbers, say they grow at about 15%. If I put in a 15% revenue growth rate and then say I put a profit margin of 10% and then a PE ratio of about 25, I get a fair value price instead at $4,438 and a total annualized return of 7.65%. So if you believe my original assumptions, I think that this is a screaming buy. However, if you only think they're going to grow at about 15% and only have a net profit margin of 10%, which they are at now, and they do not grow anymore in the future, I think that they're actually going to be at about $4,400 in the next 10 years. So you could only make about market average returns. So with that being said, do I think that this is a buy today? I do not personally believe so. I would actually be interested if it got under $2,000. I personally would potentially buy this company. Because say it got to $2,000, if we put this in right here, if it got to $2,000, you can make about a 12% return with super conservative numbers. So that's why I'm going to be waiting to about $2,000 on Mercado Libre. So thank you guys for watching this video. Please hit the subscribe and like button, and see ya.